Hi, and thanks for logging on to the Daily DVAR Halacha. And here's a brand new halacha for you, and it's for Monday, the 9th day of November. Here we go. Countertops in your kitchen, for dairy and meat, here are the general rules. It is considered most proper for a kosher kitchen to have separate countertops for the meat area of the kitchen and separate countertops for the dairy area of the kitchen. The reasons for things like this is because if you're going to end up putting down a hot fleishik pot and it's going to end up landing straight on the milcha countertop, trouble's going to happen, from that hot pot touching the milcha countertop. And that's why we try to always have separate countertops, one for meat and one for dairy. But it doesn't mean that if something fleishik just sits for a moment cold on the dairy countertop, that the dairy countertop is ruined. Most often when the things are cold, it's not going to end up being a big deal if a meat plate of something that was all cold sat on the milcha countertop for a moment. It's not really a big deal. So even if a person wanted to put a hot plate, that was holding the Shabbos food, and it was fleishik, and that sat on a milcha countertop, even that is not considered a terrible deal because it's not the hot pot sitting right on the countertop. You can even have a crock pot that has the cholent in it, and if if you needed to, it could end up sitting on the milcha countertop. That wouldn't be the end of the world. What would be a problem would be if you'd start to serve out of that crock pot, during Shabbos, with the meat, hot, dripping off onto the milcha countertop. That's when it runs into trouble. But for a cholent pot to just sit on a dairy spot of the countertop, just a crock pot, the outside of the crock pot, so the actual pot is not touching the dairy countertop, that wouldn't be so terrible if you had to do that. Nextly, if you wanted to have a cutting board for cutting vegetables up for salads, and that cutting board was used to prepare vegetables for meat meals and dairy meals, that's really going to be totally fine, because all you're doing really is cutting vegetables on that cutting board. If that's how you're doing it, then that's fine. Doesn't matter that the vegetables sometimes go into a meat meal and sometimes go into a dairy meal, because that cutting board is just cutting par of vegetables, so that's fine. New topic, but in the same general category, baking a bread that is dairy. Okay, you put dairy ingredients in that bread, so it's basically a milchik bread, is considered to be a problem because bread ends up being eaten with all kinds of meals, and we're afraid that you're going to end up eating some of that dairy bread with a meat meal. Same thing is true of the opposite, like you have a fleishik bread where gravy was in the cooking of that bread, and now that bread could end up being eaten with a dairy meal. We basically tell people, this is a halacha, that they shouldn't make dairy bread and they shouldn't make fleishik bread. Bread in general should be made parve. There are exceptions, and we're actually going to do one or two of them today and maybe a couple of them tomorrow. An exception: when would it be okay to make yourself like a dairy bread if you're making a small amount? You just wanted to make one delicious dairy bread that you're going to eat right now in this meal that's all dairy, and it's all like sort of self-contained dairy bread for the dairy meal. It'll all be over within the half hour, and it's all safe and good. And that would be one of the exceptions as to when you're allowed to make a dairy bread. Even if you're making a large dairy bread, halacha would also consider that okay if it's made in a shape that clearly shows itself to be milchik. I don't really know what that shape would be, but it would be a very unusual shape, shaped like let's joke around, maybe even shaped like a milk bottle or something that shows that it's a clearly an unusual bread and it's dairy. That too would make it a permissible situation where you would be allowed to make a dairy bread. But in general, the general rule is don't make dairy breads or fleishik breads unless it's one of these exceptions. And maybe tomorrow we'll do a couple more of those exceptions when it's okay to make a dairy bread or a fleishik bread. Thanks for logging on. Log on again tomorrow for more. Bye-bye.